Hello and welcome to DNA. I'm Mike Davis.
And I'm Ashna Salomon, and we're from Global Genetic Health. Our podcast series is going to analyze the unique components, trends, innovations, and services that make up the funeral industry, or as we like to call it, funeral DNA.
So today we're going to uncover a growing trend that we know very, very well: DNA preserving and testing. How does this fit into the funeral industry? Why should a family preserve their DNA? And as an industry, why should we be offering this type of service? So let's begin by going over some of the basic information just to catch some of our listeners up to speed. So Ashley, what is DNA?
So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which sounds very complicated. Essentially what it is, it's made of four base pairs, which we'll refer to as A, G, C, and T. And those are sort of like the alphabet that we use to create the instructions that make a person. So in that way, you can sort of think about DNA as the building blocks of life. It's very complex, and it contains the biological instructions that make you, you. DNA overall is the hereditary material found in humans and almost all organisms, and it is passed down from generation to generation.
Okay, so now that we know a little bit about DNA, is there any specifics about postmodern DNA that we should be aware of?
Absolutely. So after an individual dies, their DNA begins to degrade immediately. If it's not collected and processed or preserved, that DNA is quickly lost. In fact, cremation in particular is a surefire way to destroy all DNA. Putting a body at that heat for that amount of time ensures that there will be nothing that will be available for us to get from those ashes. Whereas the process of burial makes DNA collection difficult, not only logistically, but the environment sort of breeds a ground for bacteria and a lot of other contaminants to occur. So if an individual passes, the ideal time frame to collect a DNA sample and store a DNA sample before continuing downstream with testing or any preservation is about 30 to 60 days.
Okay, so you talk about 30, 60 days to collect it and preserve it. Now, how does this preservation take place? I know I've heard of DNA banking. What are the DNA banking options?
Yeah, so right now there's two popular DNA banking options. So if you think about secure storage or secure bankings, that's sort of what you see a lot in cinema. So a big freezer with different DNA samples and vials in there. Again, that is pretty popular today. So a sample would come into a lab facility, it would be extracted, and it would be stored in usually a -80 freezer or another similar secure environment. The downside of that is that the lab has control of that DNA sample. You can absolutely reach out and get access to that sample, but it is not yours and under only your authorization and jurisdiction. The other option is home banking vial. So the home preservation, it's a similar process. The sample arrives to a facility. They're able to do an extraction, purify that DNA, and bind it to silica beads. So by binding it to those silica beads, it helps that DNA hold that integrity and stay stable at room temperature. It is then stored at with inert gas, so to keep it in a totally concealed, essentially a suspended animation environment. And the benefit of that is that you would be able to have that DNA sample in your own home, so in your own safe at home, and you know for sure that it is only you or those that you invite into that secure space that would have access to that very special sample. So now that we've talked a little bit about how DNA can be stored, why would a family want to store that, Michael?
Well, that's a great question. DNA contains a lot of important information: genetic markers, paternity, and ancestry information. It's all contained, but it is also permanently lost through the cremation or burial process that you touched upon. So by storing DNA in a DNA home banking preservation vial, even with one of the other banking options, you are you're preserving the past and protecting the future, and you're leaving that testing option still on the table in the future.
So you said testing options are still on the table. What sort of testing could be done with somebody's DNA?
Well, that is a loaded question, as the possibilities are endless. However, most of the typical testing that is done is around relationship testing, ancestry testing, and then there's variations of genetic predisposition reports to try and find out if you carry any inherent risks to other different diseases or medical conditions.
Okay, so how would gathering this testing information in particular benefit the family?
Well, families come into the funeral home for more than just a funeral. So they're looking for ways to better understand their loved ones, who they were, where they came from, what made them, their connection to them. They're looking to really truly understand who that person was. And DNA options are able to do that through relationship testing. You can find out your actual relationship to them. With ancestry testing, you can see where that person came from, what heritage, and what made them. And with genetic predispositions, you can see if there's any genes that they carried that you also too had carried or been passed down. Like I got my freckles from my mom.
Oh, for sure. So we've all heard about ancestry on like television commercials and stuff, and those big companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. So why would we not just go through one of those providers after a loved one has passed?
Well, it's the way that we have to handle the delicate degraded postmortem DNA. So Ancestry.com, 23andMe, those providers are not able, they're not equipped to handle the delicate degraded postmortem DNA and throw it through their systems. So you'd have to partner up with a company like DNA Memorial, where they're able to extract the sample, clean it up, and provide a viable sample to the partners that they deal with. Now, they're able to provide full ancestry results on postmortem DNA for the first time ever. It does go back and they look at over 150 regions globally, and we really get to understand who a person is and where they came from as we research into the sub-regions. Now, it looks back at the family history and it covers both the maternal and paternal bloodlines, and it goes back on recent family history, sometimes 500 years or so, but they go back to the very start of each of the bloodlines, sometimes tens of thousands of years away. So now that we do know a little bit about how to bank the DNA or why to bank the DNA and what some of the testing options are, let's look into taking the DNA sample. So actually, what are the various options available and ways that this can be done, and maybe some of the pros and cons of the different options?
So DNA is found in pretty much every cell in our body, but there are some easier ways than others, or some preferred ways to collect DNA. I think a lot of the time we do see in media plucking some hair and getting a full genome sequence and stuff from that. It's not quite that simple. So with hair samples, you do need to pluck the whole hair, and you would like to, the goal is to get the follicle at the end, or like that hair root. That's what's going to have the unique nuclear DNA that is going to be specific to that individual person. You can get some genetic information from the rest of that hair strand, but it won't be of the quality that you'd be able to do some of the bigger tests, and it wouldn't be 100% unique to that particular person. So for hair sample collections, we would recommend collecting body hair, so armpit, pubic hair, any of those like thicker, coarser hairs that would have a nice big root on there. And again, the quantity would need to be at least 30 hairs or so, and that again, because if you take a look at the root, and that's what we're actually testing, you need to pull quite a few hairs in order to have a decent sample size to work with. Blood is another option as well. The blood collection itself will vary depending on the state of the individual who's passed, so it can be difficult to draw a blood sample from someone. So again, it is usually oftentimes a lot easier just to dip a sterile cotton swab or collect a blood sample that way, just by dipping it in some blood, as opposed to actually filling a vial. The downside with shipping tissue or blood samples as well is that there's often a lot of biohazardous forms that are required to send, especially with like border clearances or certain couriers who just don't want that liability. So my favorite method to sample is actually a buccal swab. So that's a simple cheek swab. It's incredibly quick in comparison to the other methods that we've discussed. And it's non-invasive, so it's easier to sort of bring up with a family member if you're going to swab your lost loved one's cheek to collect that information. And again, it usually takes the whole process, if you were to collect like 6 swabs, would take about less than 5 minutes, and it can be done before or after embalming, so it's a lot easier for your schedule. So I think we've heard quite a bit about how DNA services benefit the family, but what would be the benefit for a funeral home in providing sort of DNA services?
Great question. So, first of all, I believe that it's kind of a two-part question, or two-part answer anyways. As an industry, we should have an obligation to informing clients about DNA, its importance and its permanent loss through cremation and burial. So that's the number one thing, is using it as an education piece, because this is the last chance for the family to preserve their DNA. As we've explained, cremation and burial processes make sure that there's no more DNA to be able to be retrieved. So this is the last chance. So we have to really use it as an education piece, and I feel that as an industry we have that obligation. But secondly, when we look back at the industry itself, across all industries, the pandemic has really changed things. But over the last year, we've started to see many services being removed or minimized from the funeral industry, such as catering, coffee, tea, after services. A lot of those are being removed in certain areas or minimized to a small amount. So we're becoming very transactional. We're directing clients to specific products and then becoming transactional. Clients are going to the funeral home, and what they're looking for is highly personalized, added value services. And the DNA portfolios provide clients with just that, with companies like DNA Memorial, where they provide the funeral home with all collateral, displays, brochures, sample kits. It's really a no risk, no cost approach, and it opens up a whole new revenue stream for the funeral home. By being able to provide these added value services as well, you're answering some very important questions for clients, likely gaining a lifelong client. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today and on Funeral DNA. We're going to tune in next week to learn more about innovations, trends, and services that make up the funeral industry. Thank you.